Well, if you saw my video about taking this machine apart, I thought maybe you'd like to see it put back together. I realized I never made a video of actually running this machine and telling the rest of the story about it, but here is my oldest Spencer turbine cleaner. I believe this is from 1911 or 1912, based on the fact that the design is newer than the 1910 machines seen in advertisements of the period, but the design is obviously more early than my 1913 and 14 machines and later, and literature from those time periods. So I'm going to say this unit is from 1911 or 1912. Now, one funny thing about it is, first the badge. I love these brass badges, but I'm hesitant to try and do anything with it because I know if I try and polish it, I'm just going to polish the black paint off. And I haven't yet had any success at restoring the black paint without painting over the letters. I'm not exactly sure how you do that. But this unit is model number 424 and serial number 691. And if you look at the motor tag, this is a Westinghouse repulsion start induction run, single phase AC motor, 1.5 horsepower. You can wire it for 110 or 220. It's 3450 RPM, similar to the motors on my 13 and 14 Spencer cleaners, except those were made by Century. But if you look at the patent dates on this motor, see we've got 1914, 1915. This motor, I'm fairly certain, is newer than the rest of the cleaner. Only a few years newer. And I believe the reason for that is this machine would have been installed with a DC motor for electricity generated on premises, as was quite common at that time. Then when alternating current utilities and distribution networks came to that area and were brought onto the property, every motor in the house would have had to be changed, and so they just got a new motor and put it on. I think that's the story with this, because that would explain, there's no way this machine is from 1915. They just didn't look like this anymore. The 24 impeller stages, smaller diameter, is characteristic of the earlier Spencer machines because my 1913 and 14 units of similar size, 1 to 1.5 horsepower, have 6 larger diameter impellers. And that actually works better. It's a lot easier to assemble, moves more air at slightly lower pressure. This machine has a little bit more water lift than those, but doesn't move as much air. It moves a heck of a lot more air than like your piston pump vacuum cleaners of the time, but not like Spencer level airflow. It has the sidearm dirt separator. So in 1910s, the machine was just one vertical piece and it had trays for the dust. One up here, it would have a door that would flip up, and then one down at the bottom. The sidearm is slightly after that, and so your piping from the wall inlets would connect here. This is actually a much newer wall inlet. It's just stuck into here. And your dirt would go in here. And by raising these brass handles, one of which has broken off, careless maid. The maid always gets the blame. You can see we have a baffle inside the dirt container to prevent debris picked up from swirling around and redepositing itself on the screen, which, as you can see, is not very large. You can see that dirt comes in like right there and comes around, and your screen is just this little ice cream cone. This would have been continuously getting dirty. But this was back in the day when you were supposed to empty this thing every time you used it. Your daily work, you know, as the housekeeper of a large estate, was to use the vacuum and then empty the vacuum. You didn't treat it the way we do today and just leave months worth of dirt sitting in there. This is a bit tricky one-handed. All right. You can see I've repainted some of this glossy black, just brushed on. I mean, the cast iron doesn't take a very nice finish anyway, so I didn't go to too much trouble to make it perfect. I wanted to try the gloss. I think satin might have been more the ticket, but I like the look. You can see I did not paint the middle section. I started off by painting the things that were rusted where there was no paint left. And then I came up to here and I said, well, do I do this? And then I noticed the detail of the pinstriping that this machine originally had, this gold pinstripe design. Very fancy for a vacuum cleaner that would go in the cellar somewhere. But I really didn't want to cover that up, so I decided let's just stop. The castings are numbered. This is casting number 11. This is casting number 12. And Spencer would have ordered these castings produced for them, and then they built the machine on site. And well, let's start it up. So this is wired for 240, as it was originally. And so you can see we've got 2 power leads coming in, and then we have the windings in series. So we're gonna turn that on. You can hear that grumble just before the brushes come back down. The machine vibrates when it's in that particular RPM range. And speaking of vibration, it was actually quite troublesome to get this machine to run smoothly. All these 24 impellers are actually numbered, so you know I put them on in the correct order, but they had to be aligned vertically on the shaft to not rub the deflector below or the deflector above. And they also had to, so the shaft has 2 keyways, one on each side, and the impeller set screw can go on this side or on this side. And I thought it made sense to me, you know, not having paid attention when I took the thing apart. It made sense to me to alternate them, one on the left, one on the right, so on. Well, I got the thing put back together, and it vibrated, sounded terrible. So I tore it all back down again and put all the keys on one side of the shaft, and then it sounded pretty good, but I still had a heck of a time because that vertical alignment, you know, you'd put the housings together, bolt the thing down, and then it would rub because you were compressing all these castings. And so I'd tear it back down until I found the one that was rubbing and lower it a little bit and then try again. And so I've had this whole thing apart probably half a dozen times. And in the process, I ruined the shaft coupling. So the original shaft coupling is this, and one day when I was testing it, that happened. So obviously I'm just a barbarian that can't be trusted with antique machinery. But this has been drilled on either side of the keyway, and I believe these were actually made to be sacrificial. So if there was a binding or a vibration or something, you know, the driven load, this was a, you know, very common part in machinery. This wasn't just for vacuums. This was a sacrificial item to prevent damage to the driving machine or the driven machine. So anyway, I saved the old coupling. Fortunately, a new coupling, even though it looks somewhat different, is available that does the trick. The motor has 2 ball bearings that run in a bath of oil, and you can see our oilers here and there that you fill, little brass tubes. I suppose I could have, these are plated brass and they're stamped up with an arrow and then lower down here. I suppose I could have taken these off and polished them because that plating is a little ugly, but oh well, maybe next time. And then you have another oil-filled ball bearing down at the bottom for the turbine. And in the middle is just this bushing. This isn't really a bearing. It's more like a packing nut. So your bearings up here are just in the motor itself. And so the air goes in the separator, swirls around, goes into the turbine, and then moves downwardly through these stages, and then finally would exit into the chimney through this 2-inch tapping here that a pipe would have been connected to. This also has a little clean out access down at the bottom so that you could undo this and get to, I guess dust would accumulate down here and they wanted to give you a way to clean that out. But a couple things that really excited me about acquiring this machine were the extra goodies that it came with. So this is a chunk of the conduit that had been run to the machine that was attached to this conduit body. That's 1/2 inch rigid, and there was a grounding strap that went from this conduit to one of the motor bolts. And so this would have, as was typical of the day, your wires were just exposed kind of as like a vibration check, and there was no box. And the conduit would have run to the wall to a starting switch. And we also have the original oil can with a little bit of original oil in it. This is special turbine oil manufactured for Spencer Turbine Cleaner Company by Swan and Finch Company, New York. I've seen one of these on the internet that was in better shape, but it's kind of cool that this one came with this machine. I mean, it's shipped from the factory on a train from Hartford to upstate New York with this machine. That to me is just crazy. We also have the instruction card. Tack this up near the machine. So they just pulled the whole board off, which was smart because this paper is a bit delicate after 110 years. And I find some of these directions pretty interesting. So the third direction here, when starting, bring the turbine up to speed slowly. 10 or 15 seconds should usually be taken. They're referring to a starting rheostat, one of those dials with all the contacts, and you would move the dial slowly to start. That's DC stuff. That's direct current. That's nothing to do with this motor. And obviously they got rid of these directions, this particular item, on later machines because by then they were all AC. This is also pretty interesting. While the turbine cleaner will dispose of any ordinary dirt, dust, or even small pieces of paper, do not experiment to see how large objects you can stuff in, as you might accidentally clog the piping system by so doing. Also, do not use any longer length of hose than is required. Always use the tool best adapted. Do not leave idle hose open while machine is running, as it wastes power and causes unnecessary wear. So they're suggesting that it's better to unplug the hose and just have the machine running with no air moving through it than having the hose plugged in. I'm surprised that would cause unnecessary wear. I mean, it does use more power, but these machines generally don't care whether they're moving air or not. I mean, if it's running, it's running. And they generally just, really the only, what had stopped this one, there was a carbon brush missing. This has 2 carbon brushes. I don't know if one fell out in the course of moving it or if there was a carbon brush issue and that's when they finally stopped using the thing, God knows how many decades ago. One of the things I'd love to know about these old beasts is like, when was the last time they were actually used? How long were these actually in service? Like 1911, let's call it. Was it used for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years? Did they buy new hoses and tools from Spencer? Or, I'd just love to know, but I guess we never will. And then another really cool thing, this was a final surprise that I didn't even know about. So a lot of times the early electrical systems in houses, especially big houses, instead of a light switch when you went into each room, light switches were arranged in banks. And just like the maid would go around every evening and clean and fill and light all the oil lamps, 20 years prior, well, the maid would go around every evening and switch on the lights. And so they were put in convenient labeled banks, and this plate would have been ordered, custom engraved. And so on this particular one, for Reading Room, Library East, and Library West, happens to be a switch for the cleaner. And I don't know if this was the only switch or if there were multiple ones. This was a very large house, as you'll see. But on the back, you can see this is a single pole switch. And so clearly this would have activated a relay of some kind. And there could have been multiple switches. And I imagine there likely were. So the house this came out of was the Shepard estate called La Bergerie in New Haven, New York. And I was fortunate enough to be given some information about La Bergerie, including a picture of it from the 70s. You can see this house was added onto many, many times. It kind of looks like the Winchester Mystery House. And by the time it had been a restaurant for some time, and then they opened it for tours. And by the time it was torn down, it was over 100 rooms. Huge. Bigger than a machine of this size would have been put into. This is for your average little 6,000 square foot house, and this place you would have really wanted a bigger machine than that, but what do I know? So it's impossible to know if the house was a smaller house when the machine was installed, and maybe the central vacuum only serviced part of the house, like the 1911 part. Who knows? But this house was eventually torn down, and before that there was an auction for the contents. And that auction took place in the late 70s or early 80s, and that's when the people that contacted me, nice couple, Gene and Fred, they contacted me. They said, we have this machine. We bought it at the auction for this mansion, and it's been sitting in our barn for 40 years, and we'd like to know something about it, and are you interested in it? And so, yeah, they found the right nut that was willing to drive 12 hours and go pick this thing up. But happy to have it. Really cool. I love the story behind it, and I love the fact that it runs. I was able to get it to run, and it's ahead of its time. I mean, I believe that Spencer was always at the forefront of vacuum cleaning. Like if you had an early central vac in your house from the 1910s, other brands, you'd probably stop using the thing. It just wouldn't work very well as soon as you had a basis of comparison. But if you so happen to end up with a Spencer Turbine, you could use this. You could vacuum your house with this. And to me, that's pretty neat, pretty crazy. And that's the story. And thank you for watching, as always.